Nobody got married in the month of May during the Victorian era. In addition to secret honeymoons and symbolic cakes, the Victorian era had some pretty interesting wedding traditions. Here we have snake rings. The Victorian era didn't have the same kind of joy that we're familiar with today. While modern times usually call for a simple circular ring that could be covered with diamonds and other gemstones, the Victorian era had a very peculiar shape which included a hidden meaning. Many popular wedding bands were shaped like a snake, which presented the married couple with a very interesting piece of symbolism. The snake was supposed to represent eternity and was a symbol of everlasting love. This was a way for both the bride and the groom to confirm their commitment to one another and ensure their marriage was going to last forever. The snake could also be filled with all sorts of precious gemstones like rubies and emeralds. This really just depended on what class of society you belonged to. Some noble citizens would go all out with customizing their snake rings, while others were much simpler and made sure the serpent was the focal point. Now, could you ever imagine bridesmaids wearing white? Yes, the bridesmaid tradition was present all the way back in the Victorian era as well, but they had some very different rules that had to be followed. At today's wedding ceremonies, it's pretty much forbidden for anyone other than the bride to wear white. This includes her very best friends who've been chosen for her wedding party, ensures that they cannot steal the spotlight from the bride on her own special day. In the Victorian era, however, this was actually the complete opposite. Wedding ceremonies actually encouraged people to wear all white, and this was seen as a signature look for many weddings during this time period. Many people also considered black to be the color of mourning during this era, so it was actually frowned upon to wear this color during a joyous occasion like a wedding ceremony. Nobody ever married in the month of May during the Victorian era. It's a bit of a mystery why this was the case, but no one wanted to tie the knot in the month of May. This goes all the way back to a classic saying, marry in May, rue the day. Now, for whatever reason, it seems like many people believe that a May wedding was destined for failure. There's all sorts of different theories surrounding this bizarre tradition, but it really put a damper on the wedding business for an entire month. Instead of marrying in May, many couples tried to secure a June wedding date, as this was incredibly popular for a number of different reasons. June was incredibly close to Juno, who happens to be the god of marriage. Most people believe that this was a very good sign. It also represented the end of Lent and generally had the best weather, so all signs point towards June being the best time to get married. It would be very interesting to see how many May weddings from the Victorian era actually ended in divorce. The Victorian era also loved secret honeymoons. This is definitely the exact opposite of what happens today. In the age of social media and sharing every single moment of your life with your friends and family, it's nearly impossible to keep anything a secret. With that in mind, it's also become a pretty regular thing for people to show off their lavish vacations and let everyone know exactly where you are and what you're doing. This couldn't be more true for modern day honeymoons. Both the bride and the groom almost always love to show off their vacation together as newlyweds. In the Victorian era, this was the exact opposite of what you were supposed to do. Telling everyone about your honeymoon was thought to be in bad taste in this time period, so nobody knew where the bride and groom were heading after their wedding. The only other person who actually knew their destination was the best man, as it was his job to drive the newlyweds to the train station. But even he would be sworn to secrecy, as no one was allowed to know where they were going, and nobody wanted to be the one that brought any sort of bad luck onto the bride and groom on their special day. You were not allowed to look at your guests when you were leaving the ceremony. Now, for some reason, it was considered pretty taboo for the bride and groom to look at their wedding guests when they were leaving the chapel. Many believe this was also in bad taste, so the newlyweds had to be very careful about not breaking their stare down with the wedding carriage that was waiting on the road. They could not look left or right at everyone who had come out to celebrate the momentous occasion. This must have been incredibly difficult. It was even harder when you consider the fact that the guests were throwing rice and grain at the bride and groom as they walked out of the chapel. These tiny objects and particles were supposed to represent fertility, so this was considered a very nice gesture at the end of the big ceremony. Unfortunately, however, it also made it very difficult to not make eye contact with the people who were actively throwing things at you. Victorian era weddings also contained 3 cakes. The wedding cake is a very big deal. So much planning goes into this important piece of food, and the results are usually quite astounding. It's a big event when the newlyweds cut into their giant dessert on the big day, and the cake reveal is honestly one of the highlights of the whole event. Oddly enough, however, this was not as big of a deal in the Victorian era. That's because there were actually 3 cakes present at the wedding, and each one served a very different purpose. The first was a traditional fruit cake, and this is what all the guests received for their desserts. The second was a dark cake that was given to the groom, and the third was a light cake that was provided for the bride. While the groom was allowed to eat his cake whenever he wanted to, the bride's cake was not allowed to be touched. Instead, the light cake would be stored for a grand total of 25 years before anyone was allowed to eat it. This cake was meant to symbolize the 25th wedding anniversary of the married couple, and was considered a big reward for making it this far. Here Comes the Bride was made popular back in the 1800s. There's all sorts of different songs that a woman can walk up to the altar to. There's a little bit of freedom with the music choice in this day and age, but this is undoubtedly the most popular song you will hear playing at most weddings. What you may not know though is that this was actually popularized by Queen Victoria's own daughter, who's also named Victoria. There was no traditional wedding song up until this point, but the princess decided that she wanted to use her own theme song that was composed by Robert Wagner. Now, Wagner was one of her favorite composers at the time, and his work has clearly stood the test of time. Here Comes the Bride has been played at weddings all over the world ever since this moment. That wasn't the only song that was popularized by the princess. She also used the wedding march as she walked away from the altar for the first time as a newlywed. Breakfast receptions were also the norm in the Victorian era. Most weddings these days have late receptions that run all through the evening into the early hours of the morning. In the Victorian era, however, things were done at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. There were no late night parties with a live DJ, and the wedding wrapped up much earlier in the day. It was usually tradition to hold your wedding ceremony in the early morning, so the happy couple would have the rest of the day to celebrate. The ceremony itself wrapped up well before noon, and the reception would include a large breakfast for all the wedding guests at a separate location. This is obviously very different from what we're used to in the modern era, but the breakfast reception was a very big deal in the Victorian era and something that everyone always looked forward to. Different colored horses were a big status symbol in the 1800s. It was very easy to tell people apart by their social classes in the Victorian era. This stretched into the wedding ceremonies. You could obviously tell when a wedding was taking place for a high-ranking citizen. One of the easiest ways to spot a wealthy wedding was by observing the color of the horse out front of the chapel. Wedding carriages would almost always be pulled by horses, but the color of these creatures was actually very important. It was tradition for most people to use a white horse, but wealthy couples could sometimes spring for a gray horse. This was seen as a real status symbol at a wedding ceremony. The gray horse would drive you all the way to your breakfast reception. Brides who lived close to the reception location could just walk from the chapel, but the wealthy citizens really wanted to take a ride from an eye-catching gray horse. Underage marriages were not out of the ordinary back in the 1800s. This is something that just wouldn't fly in today's world, but it was not uncommon in the Victorian era. Girls were allowed to be married at the age of 12, and boys could marry at just 14 years of age. The interesting thing to note is that this wasn't even completely legal back then, but the authorities still allowed it. It was very similar to a traditional wedding, but more than likely had a little bit less glitz and glam than an adult wedding. The only major thing to note in this scenario is that the marriage was not considered binding until both parties were 21 years old. So many people just considered the young ceremony to be more of a gesture than anything else. Many adults also felt that it set up the young newlyweds for the future so they could think about starting a family well in advance. It's easy to see why this would never be allowed in the modern world, but times were very different during the Victorian era. Well, that wraps up our look at the 10 unusual Victorian era marriage traditions you never knew about. We hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, we'll see you next time.